All right, so for tonight's homework, we're going to do a little review on domain and range since we had a little bit of a hard time with that, and then we're going to continue our work on factoring quadratics. So the first thing is you're going to be given a graph, any particular graph. It could be quadratic, linear, exponential, and you're going to have to identify the domain. And you need to remember that the domain is the x values. Oops. So looking at this graph, we could do the domain two different ways. We could do the domain for the situation. In this situation, we're talking about a football that was kicked up and landed, okay? And then we could talk about just the domain of that situation. Or most likely, we're going to talk about the domain of the graph. And you need to remember the domain is the x value. So when we're talking about the x value, we're talking about which coordinates on this x-axis are going to be used. Now, the parabola goes forever in this direction and this direction. It's going to keep getting wider and wider and wider and wider and wider and wider. So we look at this x-axis, and if we're just looking from these 2 points, we're looking at the situation. But if we're looking at the domain of the entire graph, this graph is going to keep going in this direction, getting wider, and it's going to keep getting wider this direction. So for the domain, we would say the x values are all real numbers. For the range, we're talking about the y values. The y values are which parts of the y-axis are going to be used for this graph. And looking at this graph, you can see that the graph starts here. It doesn't cover any part of the y-axis above it. So this is at the 4. And then it continues to go in the downward direction forever. So for our range, we would say that this graph is going to be y is less than, and then we're going to say equals to because there's a solid dot here, so that includes that 4. So y is less than or equal to 4. Okay? So that includes the 4 on the y and everything below. And so our coordinates will continue to go that way. Okay? Again, if we're talking about the situation of the football, we're only talking about the 4 feet on the ground to 0. But again, most of them are going to be on the graph. Now if we look at this type of graph, we want to look at the domain. The domain is the x. So if we look at the x it starts at this point and then it continues forever in this direction. So if we were talking about the domain on this one, we would say x is greater than or equal to -4 because it's got a point here, so it includes this -4 and it goes to positive numbers. Now, if we are looking at the range, now this is going up and it's continuing to rise. So it's continuing to rise in this direction. But it starts at this part of the y, and then it's going to continue to rise. So when we're doing the range here, we would say that y is greater than or equal to 0, because this point is at -4, 0. 0 is the y value, and that's the smallest y because the graph doesn't go below here. So we know the range starts at 0, but then we also know this is gradually rising, and it's going to gradually rise to infinity, so it's going to keep increasing in height. So we know that it's going to start at 0, and then it could go to any numbers. So again, that would be our range, and that would be our domain. Okay, I put this little picture here because we've been thinking about Boston lately, and I think it's pretty important to recognize that, and I also wanted to show you a cool little video about being Boston strong.
Boston, he said, is the perfect state of grace.
This is Boston strong.
This is Boston strong. We don't forget what has happened to those families.
This is Boston strong.
This is Boston strong. Tomorrow, the sun will rise.
So for your homework tonight, you're going to need to do this worksheet here. It's right here. It says Algebra 1. Algebra 1 Monday homework. This is the video you should just watch. Now you need to click on here and complete the 10 problems on domain, range, and factoring. So make sure you got the practice in. Have a great night.